On January 31, 1945, in a snowy courtyard in Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, 12 soldiers formed a firing squad. In front of them, a man tied to a post hadn't killed, looted, or raped. He had written a letter. In the midst of World War II, when defeat meant the annihilation of entire regiments, the US Army needed more than weapons and ammunition. It needed absolute obedience. And to enforce it, it didn't hesitate to execute its own men. How far was the army willing to go to maintain control, and why, out of thousands of deserters, was only one executed? Military law and desertion, discipline in times of war. During World War II, the US military deployed more than 11 million soldiers around the world. From the battlefields of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy, from the jungles of the Pacific to the snowy villages of Belgium, the war effort required not only courage, but also an unbreakable military structure. In this context, desertion did not represent simple abandonment. It represented a direct threat to the entire military system. The High Command knew that a battle line fractured by fear could mean the loss of an entire battle, and a lost battle could drag an entire division into disaster. Therefore, among the invisible enemies the generals feared most were not German tanks or Japanese fighters, but rather internal weakness, the soldier fleeing the front with no intention of returning. Between 1941 and 1945, the Army documented 21,049 cases of desertion. Some men disappeared during combat, others simply failed to return after leave. Many fled to nearby towns, disguised themselves as civilians, or wandered about until apprehended by military police. However, not all cases were treated equally harshly. The key distinction lay in intent. When a soldier's absence exceeded 30 days, or there was clear evidence that he did not plan to return, the charge of desertion became unavoidable. Of the more than 21,000 registered deserters, 2,864 were formally tried under general courts-martial. These tribunals, the military equivalent of a top-level criminal court, had the power to impose the ultimate punishment, capital punishment. Under the Code of Military Justice in force during World War II, specifically the 1920 Articles of War, Article 58 allowed for the death penalty for desertion if it occurred in the presence of the enemy. This was the most serious charge a soldier could face outside of direct combat. Other related articles were Article 59, which regulated desertion of one's post, and Article 61, which addressed cases of cowardice in combat. Legally, a distinction was made between an AWOL, absent without leave, soldier, and a deserter. The former could be absent for a short time or with no clear intention of not returning, which entailed administrative sanctions or limited arrest. The latter involved a prolonged absence accompanied by evidence of intent not to return, which enabled harsher criminal penalties. Trials were often held near the front lines in makeshift facilities, following an expeditious process designed to review the facts, render judgment, and, above all, reinforce discipline. A general court-martial required the participation of at least 5 officers, although 7 to 9 members were more common. The process followed the provisions of the Manual for Courts-Martial, 1943 version, including arraignment, the right to defense through an assigned military attorney, the presentation of witnesses if available, and deliberation without a civilian jury. The entire trial could be conducted in a matter of hours or even in a single day, depending on the clarity of the evidence. The sentence did not take effect automatically. It required confirmation by the division commander and, in death penalty cases, the signature of the supreme commander of the theater of operations as a measure of institutional control. Of the 2,864 soldiers tried, 49 received the death sentence. These sentences were not mere threats. They were signed judicial rulings, reviewed, and prepared for execution. However, in the US Army, no execution could be carried out without the approval of the Supreme Commander of the Theater of Operations. In Europe, that responsibility fell to Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. Of the 49 death sentences, only 1 was ratified by him. The fact that only 1 deserter was executed out of 49 sentenced didn't reflect leniency. On the contrary, the message gained even greater power precisely because of its exceptional nature. Executing just 1, and doing so legally and impeccably, was intended to be engraved in the collective memory of thousands. No more was needed. 1 was enough. The policies of other militaries during the same conflict offer a telling contrast. While the United States convicted 49 soldiers and executed only one, Nazi Germany executed more than 15,000 men for desertion, often without a fair trial. In the Soviet Union, NKVD troops were authorized to immediately shoot deserters. It is estimated that tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were executed for abandoning their positions. The United Kingdom, by contrast, commuted all death sentences for desertion, opting for more lenient sanctions following the controversies generated during World War I. In this context, the United States adopted a strategy of controlled threat, contemplating the maximum punishment, applying it in an emblematic case, but making it clear that it could happen again. After the end of the conflict, the War Department established the Military Clemency Board to review trials and sentences imposed during the war. Of the more than 27,000 general courts-martial, approximately 85% resulted in a reduction or commutation of the sentence. The post-war criterion was clearly established. In peacetime, the death penalty was to be reserved exclusively for crimes involving irreversible physical harm, such as murder, rape, or treason. Desertion, however serious, was to be punished with imprisonment, not death. This criterion consolidated a policy that had already been applied de facto at the front, using threats, not firing squads, and reserving extreme punishment only for exceptional cases. Criminal record, Eddie Slovik's criminal record. Detroit, 1920s, an expanding industrial city fueled by Polish, Italian, German, and African immigration. In this urban melting pot, Edward Donald Slovik was born on February 18, 1920, to a working-class family of Polish origin. From an early age, his life was marked by poverty, conflict with authorities, and petty crime. Throughout his youth, his name would appear repeatedly in police files, court reports, and Michigan state prison records. Eddie Slovik was just 12 years old when he was first arrested. The incident occurred when, along with other neighborhood boys, he broke into a foundry to steal scrap brass. There was no violence or confrontation with employees or police, but the crime was clear: burglary with intent to steal. He was arrested and booked into the juvenile police station. The sentence did not involve prison time, but it was recorded on his juvenile record. This episode, far from being an isolated diversion, marked the beginning of a continuing series of arrests. Between 1932 and 1937, Slovik was arrested multiple times for minor offenses: theft of mechanical parts, vandalism, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. A common pattern existed in all of these arrests: impulsive acts, without elaborate planning, committed alongside other young men in depressed industrial neighborhoods. There were no weapons, there were no serious victims, but there was a repetition of behavior that caught the attention of the judicial system. In October 1937, at the age of 17, Slovik was tried as an adult for several combined offenses: attempted theft, resisting arrest, and escape. He received a prison sentence and was sent to a state correctional institution. At that time, Slovik was incarcerated at Jackson State Prison, one of the largest and most populated prisons in the country during the 1930s, located west of Detroit. It was known for housing youth with repeated non-violent offenses. He also served part of his sentence at the Detroit House of Correction, a local jail specializing in minor offenses and short-term reform schools. Both institutions were common for adolescents and young adults from marginal working-class backgrounds with no ties to organized crime networks. According to prison records, Slovik had no major disciplinary incidents during his incarceration. His record already included at least 5 formal arrests and multiple warnings from the juvenile system. He remained in prison for almost a year before being released on parole in September 1938. For a few months, he seemed to distance himself from criminal activities, but this apparent stability was shattered on January 1, 1939. That night, he and 3 friends stole a car, drove it while intoxicated, and finally crashed it into a telephone pole. They were arrested minutes later by the local police. The case went to trial, and having violated his parole, Slovik was sent back to prison. This time he served a longer sentence, extending into mid-1942. In total, between 1937 and 1942, he spent more than 4 years locked up in various Michigan institutions. During that time, he learned basic trades like plumbing and mechanics, but his criminal record continued to grow. Upon his release from prison in 1942, Slovik found a job at a small plumbing company. He settled in Dearborn, an industrial city near Detroit. There he met Antoinette Wisniewski, also a young woman of Polish origin, whom he married in November of that same year. For a few months, his life seemed to take a different course. He worked as a plumber's assistant, avoiding trouble and maintaining a stable routine. However, although his conduct had changed, his criminal record continued to determine his future. At that time, the United States was immersed in a war, and the draft system classified men by category. Individuals with serious criminal records were automatically classified as morally ineligible for military service. Slovik was classified IVF, meaning unfit for moral reasons. By 1942, more than 1.8 million men of military age had been classified as IVF for physical, mental, or moral reasons. However, beginning in mid-1943, increasing pressure to fill casualties on the European and Pacific fronts led the Selective Service Board to review hundreds of thousands of files. Slovik's case was not isolated. Between July 1943 and January 1944, more than 150,000 previously excluded men were reclassified as 1A and sent to accelerated training. These measures were part of an emergency national policy approved by the War Department. As the conflict in Europe intensified, the US armed forces began to face a growing shortage of personnel, particularly following the Italian campaign and preparations for the landings in France. The need for men forced officials to review eligibility criteria. In November 1943, the Michigan State Draft Board reviewed Slovik's file. Despite his criminal history, they concluded that he presented no physical or mental problems and that his conduct since 1942 had not led to any further arrests. He was reclassified as 1A, fit for active duty. This change in classification was common during that period. Tens of thousands of men with lesser records were reclassified so they could be sent to the front. The pressure to fill casualties was intense, and the newly formed divisions were in desperate need of personnel. Slovik was called up in January 1944. Upon joining the army, he was sent to the Fort George G. Meade Training Center in Maryland. During his basic training, his instructors and senior officers had access to his civilian record, which included his convictions from 1937 and 1939. While this didn't prevent him from joining the service, it did generate some distrust. It was common practice for soldiers with criminal pasts to be closely monitored by their officers. They were rarely assigned roles of responsibility and almost never promoted. They were frequently assigned as infantry replacements, sent to fill vacancies in units that had already suffered losses. During that same period, the U.S. Army implemented an unofficial policy of assigning ex-convicts to heavy infantry units or high-risk replacement roles. These soldiers, although legally admitted, were not eligible for promotion, voluntary transfer, or specialized technical roles. It is estimated that at least 30,000 ex-convicts were sent to the front under these conditions, most of them joining divisions with high mortality rates such as the 28th, 29th, and 90th. Slovik, being assigned as a replacement in the 109th Regiment, fit squarely into this army logistical pattern. Slovik was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division, a unit preparing for deployment to France following the Normandy landings. In August 1944, his unit was transported to Europe. From that moment on, the final phase of his brief military career would begin. Deployment in France, road to desertion. August 1944. American forces advanced through newly liberated Europe after the Normandy landings. France, still scarred by 4 years of Nazi occupation, has transformed into a chaotic and deadly combat arena. Into this context lands Edward D. Slovik, a newly arrived conscript soldier from the United States. His assignment, the 109th Infantry Regiment, part of the 28th Division. The 109th Regiment was operating east of Elbeuf in the Upper Normandy region as part of the post-D-Day advance. In late August 1944, troops of the 28th Division were crossing rural areas devastated by the fighting, including empty villages, destroyed railways, and minefields. During this phase of the German withdrawal eastward, the regiment faced scattered shelling, ambushes, and snipers positioned in wooded areas. Between August and October 1944, the 28th Division suffered more than 1,200 confirmed casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing. which accelerated the turnover of replacements and created an environment of structural fragility and internal disorganization. As a replacement, Slovik was part of the rotation system designed to cover casualties in already deployed units. These men arrived directly at the front without knowing their comrades or officers, a situation that generated isolation and psychological vulnerability. The reality of combat was far from the idealized image of war. Instead of camaraderie and shared purpose, they found chaos, strangeness, and fear. The autumn of 1944 in Normandy was particularly harsh. Constant rains turned roads into swamps, slowing troop movements and causing vehicle jams and constant falls into the mud. Temperatures dropped sharply at night, and most soldiers lacked adequate shelter, resulting in thousands of cases of mild frostbite and pneumonia across the front. Food rations, known as MREs, or meals ready to eat, were often meager, and replacements received leftovers or were sent out without full crews. The sound of artillery, nighttime bombardments, and the threat of hidden mines kept new soldiers in a constant state of alert. In this environment, disorientation among newcomers was constant and was not necessarily considered an act of insubordination, but an expected consequence of the deficient logistical system. Unlike the British or Soviet armies, which rotated entire units to maintain cohesion and morale, the US Army used an individual replacement system. Under this model, soldiers like Slovik were sent alone or in small groups to reinforce active companies without having previously trained with them. This practice, designed to keep units operational without disrupting the chain of command, caused significant dysfunction. The replacements were unfamiliar with the internal dynamics, generated distrust among veterans, and had little opportunity for rapid adaptation. In sectors such as the 109th Regiment, replacements represented up to 35% of the total active troops by September 1944, multiplying the incidence of disorientation, logistical errors, and involuntary absences. The 28th Division was operating in the Elbeuf area south of Rouen during a phase of its eastward advance. During its initial move to the battle line, the convoy was hit by German artillery fire during a night attack. The explosions disrupted the formation and caused confusion among the new arrivals. In the midst of the bombardment, Slovik and another soldier, John Tanky, became separated from the main column. Disoriented, the two wandered until they found a position controlled by the Canadian military police. They explained their situation as an involuntary separation during the attack. The Canadians didn't consider them deserters but rather strays and temporarily assigned them to logistical duties in their unit. They remained under Canadian protection for 6 full weeks. In that sector of the front, Canadian military police units operated alongside US troops, primarily in logistical control and perimeter security duties. It was not uncommon for disoriented soldiers like Slovik and Tanky to be picked up by Allied contingents other than their original unit. The protocol in these cases consisted of verifying their identity, providing temporary assistance, and notifying their regiment for formal reintegration. Meanwhile, the soldiers were integrated into auxiliary duties such as cooking, transport, or supply guarding. In Slovik's case, his 6-week stay with the Canadians was neither irregular nor suspicious by campaign standards. Dozens of similar cases occurred without resulting in sanctions, precisely because of operational chaos and the lack of inter-unit communication. On October 7, 1944, the Canadians arranged for their return to the US 109th Regiment. Upon their return, no charges were filed against them by the chain of command. Temporary separations during combat operations were common on the European front and were rarely considered formal desertions. However, that same day, after his reinstatement, Slovik requested an audience with his commanding officer. The conversation marked a turning point in his military career. With unusual frankness, he declared that he was unprepared for combat, that he was experiencing uncontrollable fear, and that if he were sent back to a frontline unit, he would flee. The captain warned him of the dire consequences of such a decision, explaining that he could face a court-martial for desertion in a combat zone. Despite the stern warning, Slovik did not change his position. He did not request a medical evaluation or psychological help. Since there was no consummated act of desertion, the officer simply ordered him to return to his assigned position in Company G. The next morning, as the unit prepared to move, Slovik executed his plan. He didn't take up his position in the formation. Instead of marching toward the front with his company, he deliberately walked in the opposite direction. He traveled more than 10 kilometers away from the front lines, passing through recently liberated French villages until he met up with a cook belonging to the 112th Infantry Regiment. Upon appearing before this soldier, Slovik handed over a handwritten document that would forever change his fate. It was a confession admitting his desertion and expressing his refusal to return to combat. With this act, consciously or unconsciously, Slovik crossed a line that separated him from thousands of other deserters. He left a written and signed record of his voluntary abandonment of duty. The signed note, confession that sealed his fate. On the morning of October 9, 1944, a cook in the 112th Infantry Regiment received a letter that would go down in the history of American military justice. The document, written in pencil on notebook paper, with rudimentary spelling but an unequivocal message, would become central evidence in one of the most extraordinary cases of World War II. That letter, signed by Edward Donald Slovik, was not written under duress or in response to interrogation. It was a voluntary confession that would lead him to become the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. Its text read, "I, Private Eddie D. Slovik, 368-96415, confess to having deserted the United States Army. At the time of my desertion, we were in Elbeuf, France. I went to Elbeuf as a replacement. They were shelling the town and we were ordered to dig in for the night. The next morning we were shelled again. I was so scared, nervous and shaking that when the other replacements left I couldn't move. I stayed there until it calmed down. Afterward I walked into town. I didn't see any American soldiers, so I spent the night in a French hospital. The next day, I surrendered to the Canadian Military Police Corps. After being with them for 6 weeks, they turned me over to the Americans. They set me free. I told my commanding officer my story. I told him if I had to go back to the front, I would run away. He replied that he couldn't do anything for me, so I ran away again, and I will do it again if I have to go back." The text was unadorned. It contained no complaints or elaborate justifications. It was the straightforward confession of a soldier openly declaring his refusal to return to combat. The cook handed the note to a sergeant who consulted with a lieutenant. Within hours, Slovik was brought before Captain Vincent Himmel, who offered him a way out. He could tear up the note, return to his unit, and avoid serious consequences. Slovik refused. The case was referred to Lieutenant Colonel Henry Summer of the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. Understanding the potential seriousness of the matter, Summer summoned Slovik for a private conversation where he explained that desertion in a war zone was a capital offense punishable by death. To ensure he fully understood the implications, he asked him to draft a second statement acknowledging the consequences of his confession. Slovik took the back of the original paper and wrote that he understood he was handing over an incriminating document, but that he still didn't want to return to the front lines. He signed again, closing off any possibility of pleading ignorance about the consequences. Even then, Summer made a final attempt to resolve the situation without a court-martial. He offered him a transfer to another infantry regiment where no one would know his record. He promised him a second chance without reprisals or charges if he voluntarily returned to duty. Slovik again refused, stating that he preferred to be tried and accept his punishment rather than return to combat. His attitude, according to witnesses, was completely rational and calm. After all avenues of conciliation had been exhausted, Lieutenant Colonel Summer ordered his formal arrest for desertion under Article 58 of the Code of Military Justice. What made this case extraordinary was not the desertion itself, but the voluntary written confession and the persistent refusal to recant when offered multiple opportunities. Throughout the entire European campaign up to that point, there was no other documented case of a soldier who had confessed his desertion in writing without coercion and who repeatedly refused to withdraw that evidence. This uniqueness turned the case into a strategic dilemma for the military high command. Military justice, the trial that no one stopped. On November 11, 1944, as the Western Front prepared to face the harsh European winter, an extraordinary trial was held in the town of Rötgen in newly occupied German territory. A military tribunal composed of 9 U.S. Army officers convened to try Private Slovik, who was formally charged with wartime desertion. The composition of the tribunal was based primarily on logistical criteria. As the 28th Division was in active combat, the panel was composed of administrative and logistical officers from other units. The trial was presided over by an infantry colonel, with Captain John Green as the prosecutor and Captain Edward Woods as the defense counsel. The formal charge was willful desertion in time of war in the presence of the enemy under Article 58 of the Code of Military Justice, which provided for the death penalty. The main evidence was incontrovertible: the defendant's written and signed confession, reinforced by the testimony of the officers who had offered to drop the charges. During the brief trial, which lasted barely an hour and a half, Slovik remained completely silent. He did not testify in his defense or deny the facts. His defense attorney did not call witnesses or present technical arguments. The strategy was complete passivity, waiting for the maximum sentence to be commuted to prison, as had happened in all similar cases up to that point. The court's deliberation was brief. The verdict was unanimous, guilty with no recommendation for mercy. The sentence, death by firing squad. What made this case unique was its exceptionality in the context of American disciplinary policy. Throughout the war, although thousands were tried for desertion and dozens were sentenced to death, Slovik would be the only one executed. This distinction was due to a unique combination of legal, temporal, and strategic factors. Each death sentence required the approval of the division commander and ultimately of General Eisenhower as Supreme Commander. Major General Norman Cotter, commanding the 28th Division, upheld the sentence on November 27th, arguing that it was a necessary measure to stem the rising tide of desertions that threatened the operational readiness of units in combat. The case reached Eisenhower's desk in December 1944, coinciding with the preparations for the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. Reports indicated a worrying increase in desertion rates among infantry units subjected to prolonged combat. In this critical context, Slovik's letter took on special symbolic value. It represented an open challenge that could undermine discipline at a decisive moment. On December 23rd, Eisenhower signed the execution confirmation, rejecting the clemency he had granted in all previous cases. The decision to execute Slovik alone was based on both legal and strategic criteria. In other similar cases, review courts had considered mitigating factors such as psychological disorders, remorse, or extreme combat conditions. Some soldiers received commutation after demonstrating severe combat stress or after presenting favorable medical reports. In Slovik's case, his prior criminal record, although not officially mentioned as a reason, likely influenced perceptions of his character and discipline. Even more decisive was the extraordinary clarity of the evidence: a written confession, consciously reaffirmed, and a persistent refusal to accept multiple opportunities for reintegration. The historical moment was also crucial. The execution was decided during the preparations for the Battle of the Bulge, when the High Command was seeking to strengthen discipline within its ranks. In that context, Slovik became the example that military strategy needed, the resounding message addressed to thousands of soldiers who might consider abandoning their posts during the critical winter offensive. Unlike other condemned prisoners, Slovik did not have officers actively interceding on his behalf, nor did he have medical evaluations that revealed psychological disorders. His case combined what might be called a perfect storm of adverse factors that made him the only one among thousands to face the firing squad. Steel discipline, the American Army's only execution. On the morning of January 31st, 1945, in the small French town of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, the only execution for desertion in the U.S. Army during World War II took place. Temperatures were below zero, snow covered the rooftops, and the streets were deserted as 24-year-old Eddie D. Slovik was driven to his final destination. The chosen setting was the backyard of a house requisitioned by the Army, whose stone wall provided complete privacy. In the center of the yard, a 15-centimeter-wide wooden post awaited the condemned man. The execution would be supervised by the commander of the 109th Regiment, to which Slovik had briefly served. Minutes before 10, Slovik was taken from his cell. He was wearing a uniform stripped of insignia and metal buttons, following the military tradition of separating the condemned from his identity as a soldier. Due to the extreme cold, he was covered with a field blanket. A Catholic military chaplain accompanied him on the short journey, offering him the last rites. According to witnesses present, Slovik calmly responded, "Father, pray for me up there. I'll pray that you don't come too soon." He showed no resistance when two attendants led him to the post and secured him with leather straps across his chest, abdomen, and thighs. To prevent his body from collapsing when shot, they installed a metal hook on his back, anchored to the post. Finally, a soldier placed a black hood over his head. Slovik did not request any final words or ask him to write a final letter. The platoon consisted of 12 soldiers from the 109th Regiment selected by their superiors. Each received an M1 Garand rifle with a single cartridge. 11 contained live ammunition and 1 blank, although none knew which contained inert ammunition, a tradition intended to ease the conscience of the executioners. At 10:04, the officer gave the order, "Ready, aim, fire." The barrage was simultaneous. Slovik's body was hit 11 times, 4 of them life-threatening, in the left shoulder, chest, upper abdomen, and neck. However, he did not die instantly. The medical officer recorded vital signs for approximately 15 minutes, until finally certifying his death at 10:19. His body was wrapped in a military tarp and transported to the WWII American Military Cemetery, where he was buried in Section E, a separate area reserved for soldiers executed for serious crimes. His grave bore no white cross or insignia, only a marker bearing his identification number 36896-415. In that same section lay 95 other American soldiers executed for crimes such as murder and rape. Slovik's name and the circumstances of his death remained secret for years. No official announcement was made to the troops, although the message circulated discreetly. "A man has been shot for desertion." In the following days, several commanders reported a notable decrease in desertion attempts, especially critical during the final phase of the Battle of the Bulge, when Allied troops faced not only the enemy but also extreme weather that caused numerous casualties from frostbite. Antoinette Slovik, his wife, received only vague notifications about his death in the line of duty. It wasn't until 1954, with the publication of the book The Execution of Private Slovik by William Bradford Huey, that the American public and his widow learned the full details of the case. For years, Antoinette tried to obtain veterans' widows' benefits and a pension, but they were denied due to the nature of his conviction. Until her death in 1979, she unsuccessfully sought a posthumous presidential pardon for her husband. In 1987, Eddie Slovik's remains were finally exhumed and repatriated to the United States. He was buried next to his wife in Detroit's Woodmere Cemetery with a simple headstone displaying his name, dates, and military rank, with no mention of the circumstances of his death. The Slovik case represents a unique intersection in American military history, the exact point where disciplinary power at its most extreme meets human vulnerability in the face of the horrors of war. His execution, viewed in historical perspective, continues to raise questions about the proportionality of punishment and the ethical limits of military duty in times of conflict. The other 48, those who survived the final verdict. In the same trenches where Slovik fought, tens of thousands of soldiers faced the same moral dilemma: do their duty or give in to the natural fear of imminent death. Thousands deserted, and among them 48 received the same sentence as Slovik, but fared better. Their stories, less well-known but equally revealing, reveal the complex nuances of military justice in wartime. These 48 men were a heterogeneous group. They came from various divisions: infantry, artillery, and armored corps. Some were repeat offenders, having attempted multiple escapes. Others had committed desertion aggravated by additional acts, theft of military supplies, document forgery, or desertion during active combat. Several had complex psychological profiles with prior trauma or personality disorders. What united them was simply their sentence. All had been sentenced to death for desertion. A representative case was that of a soldier from the 5th Regiment who deserted 3 times in a row during the Italian campaign. After his 3rd escape, he was captured by the military police and summarily tried. The court sentenced him to death, but a military psychiatrist diagnosed him with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, arguing that his escapes were a pathological response to prolonged combat. His sentence was commuted to confinement in a military hospital. Another case involved an artillery soldier who, on the eve of Operation Market Garden, shot himself in the foot to avoid participating in the offensive. He was tried for self-harm and desertion and received a death sentence. However, after the intervention of his commanding officer, who argued that the soldier had served with distinction for 2 years, his sentence was reduced to 25 years of hard labor. After the war, this sentence was again reviewed and reduced to 10 years. The reasons for commutations varied according to individual circumstances, but can be categorized into several identifiable patterns. Prior service record was a determining factor. Those with decorations or honorable mentions were more likely to receive clemency. The intervention of superior officers was also crucial. If a commander personally requested a review of a sentence, it was frequently granted. Medical factors played a decisive role in many cases. Unlike during World War I, when psychiatric diagnoses were rudimentary, during World War II, military doctors had developed a more sophisticated understanding of combat shock, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Soldiers with recognizable symptoms, chronic insomnia, uncontrollable tremors, dissociative episodes, frequently received medical evaluations that recommended treatment rather than punishment. The specific circumstances of the desertion also influenced the review of sentences. Abandoning one's post during a period of relative calm was considered more serious than doing so after weeks of intense combat. Group escapes were judged more severely than individual cases. Pre-planned desertion was less susceptible to leniency than impulsive acts. There were also social and cultural factors that, although not formally reflected in the case files, influenced the decisions. Soldiers with dependent families, especially those with young children, were more likely to receive clemency. Those with higher formal education or respected previous professions, doctors, lawyers, teachers, often benefited from a favorable disposition from the reviewing courts. The historical timing of the sentence was also decisive. As the war moved toward its conclusion, particularly after the German surrender in May 1945, pending sentences were systematically reviewed using more lenient criteria. The Allied victory allowed humanitarian considerations to begin to prevail over the tactical needs of maintaining iron discipline. A particularly illustrative case involved 3 soldiers from the 3rd Division who had deserted during the Sicilian campaign. Sentenced to death in September 1943, they remained on death row for over a year while their cases were reviewed by various courts. After D-Day, with Allied victory looming, their sentences were commuted to 30 years in prison. In 1950, during the post-war period, all 3 were pardoned and released. The contrast with the Slovik case is revealing. The other 48 condemned prisoners managed, through various circumstances, to avoid execution. Some had officers who actively interceded on their behalf. Others benefited from timely medical diagnoses. Many were simply fortunate enough to have their cases reviewed at a time when disciplinary policy was being relaxed. Slovik, on the other hand, had a perfect storm of adverse factors: a prior criminal record, an undisputed written confession, the absence of officers willing to intercede, the coincidence of a critical moment, the Battle of the Bulge, when the High Command was seeking to reinforce discipline, and an attitude that was interpreted as defiant. The fates of these 48 men after the war varied. Most served reduced sentences in military prisons such as Fort Leavenworth or Portsmouth Naval Prison. With the arrival of the post-war era, many benefited from partial or full pardons during the 1950s and 1960s. Some returned to civilian life, attempting to reintegrate into a society that celebrated veterans, but ignored those with problematic backgrounds. Others remained institutionalized, moving from military prisons to federal penitentiaries, especially those whose desertion had been accompanied by other serious crimes. The contrast between these 48 cases and Slovik's raises profound questions about the nature of military justice, the discretion in the application of extreme punishments, and the fine balance between the need to maintain discipline and respect for human life, even in the most extreme circumstances of a world war. While Eddie Slovik lay in an unmarked grave in France, these 48 men continued to live, bearing the weight of having been one step away from sharing his fate. Their stories, lesser known but equally significant, complete the picture of how the US military system handled one of the oldest dilemmas of war: what to do with those who, faced with the horrors of combat, choose to flee. Most of these men lived long enough to see how social attitudes toward desertion evolved. During the Vietnam War, desertion ceased to be universally viewed as an act of cowardice and was, in some circles, considered a form of political protest or moral resistance. The peace movements of the 1960s and 1970s began to question the historical harshness with which deserters had been treated. This shift in public perception culminated in 1977 when President Jimmy Carter granted amnesty to Vietnam deserters. It was an implicit recognition that fear, a crisis of conscience, or opposition to a specific war could be understandable reasons for abandoning military service. A concession that came too late for Eddie Slovik, executed 32 years earlier, but which reflected a significant evolution in understanding the human complexity of war. But while these deserters managed to commute their sentences for medical, tactical, or administrative reasons, the US Army tolerated an even more uncomfortable reality: the existence of soldiers who committed documented war crimes, rape, murder of prisoners, looting, and yet were never tried or executed. Eddie Slovik's case was the only one where the judicial machinery followed suit with pinpoint precision. In others, silence, omission, or hierarchical protection were the sole option. During World War II, at least 443 American soldiers were sentenced to death for crimes other than desertion, primarily rape and murder. Of those sentences, 96 were actually executed, the rest were commuted, but beyond these figures, thousands of crimes committed by American troops against enemy civilians never even reached trial. In the European theater, there are records of gang rapes committed by soldiers during the advance through France, Belgium, and Germany. Some were reported by local mayors, others by military chaplains. In most cases, the institutional response was minimal: administrative transfer or dismissal from the army without criminal charges. In Normandy, several internal military police reports documented sexual abuse committed in the weeks following D-Day. A document from the Allied Supreme Command, dated July 1944, warned of an increasing pattern of criminal conduct against the civilian population which requires immediate attention. Even so, only a fraction of these cases were formally prosecuted. The victims, mostly peasant women, did not speak English, had no legal representation, and were pressured not to file complaints. In Germany, the figures were even more dire. By the end of 1945, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and the Office of the Judge Advocate General of the Army received more than 450 reports of crimes against civilians committed by Allied troops, many of them filed for lack of evidence, even though witnesses existed. The case of German prisoners of war executed without trial also offers a brutal contrast. In several campaigns, especially in Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes, there are records of American units shooting surrendered enemy soldiers for fear of reprisals or outright retaliation. Some officers admitted to these executions in confidential reports as part of the chaos of combat. Most of these incidents were covered up or reinterpreted as killed in action and did not result in any formal prosecution. In contrast, Slovik's trial was legally impeccable. He received an assigned defense, voluntarily signed his confession, was informed of the consequences, and still stood his ground. He committed no acts of violence, harmed no civilians or military personnel, destroyed no property, or compromised operations. He simply refused to fight, and he did so in writing. That transparency, paradoxically, was what sealed his conviction. Why was Slovik executed and not so many others whose actions were objectively more serious? The answer lies in the operational realm. His execution was not based on the proportionality of the crime, but on its tactical utility. In December 1944, desertion rates were rising, especially in infantry units under extreme weather conditions. Commanders needed an immediate example. Slovik was the perfect candidate. He had no internal allies, no decorations, showed no signs of mental disorder, and most importantly, he made no secret of his decision. Meanwhile, soldiers with a history of violence or serious crimes had hierarchical protection networks, colleagues willing to cover for them, or simply the benefit of anonymity. Slovik, on the other hand, signed his own sentence by handing over his written note. He was visible, isolated, and expendable. Several military historians have pointed out that Slovik's execution was a symbolic device, not an act of balanced justice. In the words of historian William Manchester, Slovik died not for what he did, but for what others might do if they were not shown what would happen. Even within the army, some officers privately questioned the choice. One of them, quoted anonymously in an internal 1946 memo, wrote, "How many assassins did we have who weren't touched? And we killed one who only wrote that he was afraid." The Slovik case, when viewed alongside the unpunished crimes of the same conflict, reveals a logic of justice that is more functional than moral. He was not the only one convicted nor the only coward, but he was the only one who perfectly fit the mold of the necessary disciplinary example. This combination of technical legality, strategic context, and administrative visibility explains why he died while others, more culpable, lived. His story, then, not only reflects the rigidity of the war code, but also the selective priorities of an army at war, punishing where it was easy, useful, and opportune.